Hi, trainees. It's a great pleasure to meet up with you in this way, even though it's a slightly attenuated way, for this trainee webinar to discuss RAC surgical training during COVID times. We've got an excellent panel for you this afternoon. There's Maxine Ronald. She'll come up in a minute. Maxine's a surgeon from Whangarei in New Zealand and is on the council and on the education board. Chairs our Indigenous Health Committee and has many other hats, which you'll see as we go along. We've also got Adrian Anthony. He's the chair of BSET. That's the committee where all your training boards come together and discuss policy and work out common grounds and common goals for surgical training. We have the chair of your surgical trainees committee, James Churchill, and I must say US trainees always have managed to pick very good chairs. So the chairs over the years I've been on council have been exceptionally good advocates for you as trainees, and we listen to them very, well, their contribution is very valued, and James is no exception. And last but not least, we have Julian Archer. Julian's the Executive Director of Education at the college. He's a paediatrician by training, but his passion is medical education, which he holds several professorships, and we're very fortunate to have him at the college anyway, but certainly during these trying times, he's showing a lot of leadership. So that's the panel, and I can't see them yet, but hopefully they will come up in a minute. So thank you. Well, they're coming on. So thank you for sending in those questions beforehand. There's lots of questions we've got, and we won't get through all of them individually, but they certainly follow themes, as you would expect, and so we'll tackle the themes by getting certain questions choosing questions as examples of those themes. So there's your panel. No, one more. James is somewhere. Anyway, James will undoubtedly come in. And we're also expecting Tony Sparnan, the president, to drop in, and he also wants to connect with you in this way. So there's James, right? So one of the things underlying a lot of these questions, first of all, I guess we want to acknowledge that it's been a very stressful time for many people in our two countries, or in the world, in fact, but certainly for you as trainees. We just acknowledge how the uncertainty and the disruption to your training plan has been very, very anxiety provoking. And it's certainly, we want to assure you, I guess, during this time that we're behind the scenes, or the college and the specialty societies have been working incredibly hard and with you very much in our minds. So communications only come out from sporadically, and this is one way of doing it, but certainly there's a lot of work and a lot of attention being paid to your learning and your progress and your well-being, in fact, as we realize it's more than just learning and work at this time. So one of the things that have come out is the questions about, I guess, now I'm not doing surgical training, do I need to pay fees? Or now I'm not am I getting surgical training if I'm not doing elective operating? And I answered some of those underlying things in that letter we sent to you. But I just asked Maxine Ronald now, and Maxine's been working on the surgical competency framework, and that's really the blueprint for what we want a surgeon to be. So at the end of your training, that's what we want to be. And I just asked Maxine perhaps to fill out the realities of what is a surgeon if they're not doing elective operating every day. Maxine.
Thanks, Phil. Kia ora, everybody. So I can really appreciate and understand the anxieties that trainees may have about the limitations because of COVID and reduced capacity to continue to develop your technical skills. And I think that's something that all surgeons probably carry that anxiety with them throughout training and even afterwards, and even as surgeons. So I really appreciate that. But being a surgeon is not just operating, and it's not just the technical side of things, and it's not just and it's just not just assessing and seeing patients in clinics. We really have worked really hard, particularly in the last year, to go over again those non-technical professional skills, which RAC really thinks is really important to developing good surgeons, with the ultimate goal that that we service our community. So we hope that those professional skills we've worked on really reflect what the community wants. And so that those professional skills have been reviewed in the last 12 months, and you've probably all heard that there's an extra competency which has been added to those 9 professional competencies, which is a cultural competency and cultural safety. So all of that is being worked on in a new curriculum kind of review with a working group by the professional skills working group. But it's really, we feel like we understand that this will be a difficult time for those of you who don't have access to as much operating as you would have ordinarily had. But it is an opportunity, because it's such a historical kind of time, to really focus on those non-technical skills like collaboration and teamwork, leadership, communication, advocacy, all of those things that COVID is actually really kind of exposing as being really important in these times when we're having to work in really constrained environments. So we hope that you'll still value those, even if you can't be getting operating and procedural skills as much as you would like, because those are the core of being a surgeon as much as operating.
Thanks, Maxine. I just realised, I guess, as I introduced the rest of the panel, I didn't introduce myself, and that's so I am Phil Carson, and I'm the Censor-in-Chief, which just means heading up the education committee and the education side of the college, and I'm based in Darwin as a general surgeon. And so just going on from that, Julian Archer, I wonder if we could ask you just to give some picture to the viewers, the trainees, about what actually goes on with their trainee fees, both within the college and within the specialist societies.
Yeah, indeed. And I think at this time, the work has been probably more important. It's been busier and more sustained than perhaps it normally is. And one of the things that has been fantastic behind the scenes has been the strong relationships between the college and specialty societies, who of course work in partnership to deliver training programs. And those meetings, to bring that together, there are regular meetings of all the CEOs between the college and the societies. Myself and my head of training services, who works in my team, who has responsibility on the day-to-day basis for training with the college. We meet regularly, indeed every week, with the training managers in the specialty societies. So because the whole situation is so fluid, you'll know that better than any of us. We're not where we were, where we thought we might be, a month ago. Decisions that we're thinking about, and what we do next, how we innovate, what we change, what we support, things that we think we can't do at the moment, they change every week. And so the kind of pace of work has had to reflect that. And that's meant, a lot of activity, a lot of dynamic conversations, a real opportunity really to work together very closely to continuously think, what is it that we can do to support training. We developed right at the beginning some educational principles as a college for how we should approach education during this time. And the overarching principle is that RACs will act in the best interests of patients and communities. But we also then, the second principle is that we'll act in the best interests of stakeholders. And at the forefront of that is you as the trainees going through your training. And we're conscious that sometimes there may even be a rub there between supporting what is best for patient care against what it is that you are wanting to do in training, and Maxine's spoken to that, where naturally it's about wanting to get hands-on experience, but also recognizing that in these change times, commitments are going to potentially be different for you as trainees. For example, we've developed a paper around the principles for the college for redeployment. So how we think surgical trainees, should be appropriately redeployed if that's required. And I think, we're not quite where we thought we might be 6 weeks ago, but I don't think any of us would dare to predict what lies ahead in terms of COVID. And as Phil's mentioned, that even being a patchwork model, not a countrywide, be it in Australia, never mind across the Tasman. So it's a difficult piece and a moving piece. And I think we make decisions 1 week and we say 2 weeks later that was the right decision at the time, but it's not the right decision now. And that's created a lot of activity and opportunity to innovate. And I'm happy to talk more about that sort of work that we're doing. But I think we're all, of course, working remotely, but I think we're probably, my team are as busy, if not busier than ever. That's great to be able to rise to that challenge and try to make the best that we all can out of this strange situation that we find ourselves.
Thanks, Julian. I also forgot to mention at the thing, we'll be taking questions throughout the webinar. There's a little box there that you can send questions in, and we'll see that. And if we can answer some of those, and you can respond to things as we go on. So one of the big theme of questions coming through was about exams, and that's not unexpected, I guess, because they are big milestones in a trainee's life, or in anyone's life, really, but certainly as a surgical trainee. And I think you'll all understand now why the fellowship exam was cancelled in May, and certainly it wouldn't have been possible, I don't think, to run it in the traditional way this coming month. There has been all this work from the very beginning, in fact, as soon as from early March, when we realised what this might mean to us as two countries. There's been work and workarounds going on about how we might deliver all aspects of surgical training, including exams, in a new environment. And that, as some of your questions picked up, that may go on to next year. It's not just about this year. There may well be restrictions or intermittent restrictions in travel and getting together going into next year. So we can tell you that we do intend to run a fellowship exam at the end of this year. The dates will be somewhere between mid-September and mid-November, so probably towards the middle of that. And a lot of work of that is going into that at the moment. James, you have been in on a few of these critical decision-making groups. I wonder if you'd just like to share with your fellow trainees about the sort of activity you've seen, I guess, and what might be the principles there going forward in delivering those exams.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Phil. So the college has been very keen to engage trainees in discussions about what the rest of training for this year looks like through the COVID crisis. And I'd have to say that Phil and Adrian and other members of the Court of Examiners and the Education Board Executive have been very welcoming and accepting of trainee feedback and trainee concerns about progression through training. So the principles that guide how the exams may be run later on this year have only just been agreed on by the college, and there was a great deal of work that happened over the past couple of months and culminating in a series of meetings over the past week or so that have allowed for us to be able to, I suppose, to flag a move forward, recognising that this is a difficult situation for any organisation to make many future plans for without really having the right contingencies in place. The worst thing that we as a college, I suppose, could do would be to say, yep, let's crack on and do something one way, and then to find that we're unprepared for changes in that that are necessitated by restrictions that we have. So the principles that we have around the time frame that Phil just mentioned in terms of mid-September through November are going to be built on over the space of the next week or so. Phil, I think, might talk about the next steps for communication as part of this just now as well. and we're very keen to ensure that trainees are aware of what kinds of things they can plan for. And over the next little while, the immense task for the college, for the Court of Examiners, for the Education Board is working out what the requirements are for those exams in terms of the college being prepared for them, how they will look, what kinds of contingencies we have in place, and coming back to the principle that we want all of the decisions that the college make to be as fair as they can for stakeholders, including first and foremost trainees, when it comes to these considerations. So certainly the RACSTA committee and executive and the committees within the college that I've been involved with in making these decisions are very aware that exams and progression through training is a first and foremost consideration in trainees' minds at the moment, and we're doing, I believe, genuinely as good a job as can be done in the current environment to get some clarity going forward. And we do also commit, of course, to communicating these as timely as they can be made, and making sure that if and when we can move more towards the business as usual, that we're preparing to do so. So I'll hand back to Phil at that point.
Yeah, so James mentioned about further communications, and we certainly do well, we want to keep you up that. And in fact, we're planning a exam-orientated webinar in a few weeks' time when we'll be able to actually share more detail with you. In this dynamic environment, it's obviously going to be a very tight timeline, and the intent is to test and examine the same competencies and the same things. So you don't have to study any different, but obviously the delivery of the exam will have to alter to account for a situation where we can't all congregate in one place and in one hospital to do exams. Adrian, do you want to just follow up with any other information or general information about the exams?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Phil. And I think it is important to also make sure that if you are planning or were planning to sit the exams this year, that you continue to do so, that you continue to have your study plan and follow that, ensure that you are interacting with your consultants as much as you can in practicing your vivas, in getting advice, doing written papers, having those marked and fed back to by consultants. So continue to do all of those exam preparation activities that you were planning to do. The fact that the exam might be run in a slightly different format would not preclude you from actually studying in the same way, and that is, the way you study now and were preparing to study would hold you well. So whilst there may be some modifications to the way the exam is going to be delivered, as Phil has said, it's really important to understand that the same components that would have been examined in the fellowship if we didn't have COVID would continue to be examined. It will just be potentially in a different way. So be prepared for that, and please don't take your foot off the pedal in terms of exam preparation.
In the earlier questions, oh yes, Julian, please.
Sorry, I was just coming in on the chat. I help say a little bit more. So a number of people are asking about do the date span that you've mentioned between the middle of September to the middle of November include the written, the clinical, and vivas. I mean, obviously, normally we run the written a month before the vivas and clinical. So I don't know if we're able to say a little bit more about that. I suppose we're talking about different delivery. So I suppose there's, I think there will be obviously written and viva components. But from our perspective, in terms of exactly what, exactly when, I think is still fluid at this moment. I think that would be fair to say. But I think we're saying that the exam as a whole is likely to sit within that window. Do you think that's fair, Phil?
Absolutely, yes, I think that's right. And those normal timelines between the written and the vivas may change, but that's all to be decided in the coming weeks and months. And we will, like I said, we'll have that update webinar for you. And even then, I think even in say 2 or 3 weeks' time, it still won't be in concrete, but we'll, yeah. The other, I guess, principle that some people have asked, we'll be concentrating on those who did book for the May exam. For some of the smaller specialties, there may be a possibility of bringing in those who would normally would have sat in the end of the year, but I guess the first attention will be given to those who missed out in May. So I think if you can all bear with those general, fairly general comments, but very.
That's sort of discussion. Is that fair? We're asking for the additional exams.
So, Julian, I think
couldn't hear a word.
Yeah, we didn't miss most of that. Okay. Oh, look, that sounds like our president, Tony Sparnan, on the line, and he missed out on that early thing. So between this and the incoming question, Tony, would you like to speak?
Yeah, look, I've been able to hear everything, but I think they saw one glimpse of me and my beard, and everything went blank. So I haven't been. I don't think you've seen a word, and I haven't been able to speak. So I'm on my phone, and what it has shown me that as we move forward with using any video equipment, we're going to have to test it very, very well, because from my point of view, I would have failed my first exam because I turned up late. So we really have to, and similarly, I couldn't hear a word that Julian's saying. But I will leave it back to the question, but I just want to let everyone know that this is an absolute priority for the college, along with all the other things that we've been talking to the health ministers and everybody about. This is a huge priority. Is progressing our workforce pipeline. We want to have selection. We want to have ongoing training. We want to have exams. So all trainees understand that. And it's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of hard work to get it up and running. We don't want to have what I've just been through, that I've been getting stressed that I can't join you. Just imagine if it was one of your vivas and you couldn't connect, you'd be extremely stressed. So we do have to sort all these little problems out. It sounds easy, but when you hit the days, little problems occur. But we are going to fix it, and we're going to get an exam, hopefully for the majority of you. Some specialties aren't 100% sure yet whether they can provide an exam, but the vast majority can. So I won't annoy you anymore. I'll just sit back and listen. Good luck to you all, and stay safe, please.
Thanks so much, Tony. So the other question or series of questions came up is about fees and refunds. Extending from can I have my fees refunded because I'm not training at the moment, through to if I have to extend training due to if I have to extend training because I haven't got my milestones in place, what happens to my fees then? Perhaps Adrian, could you give some of the principles we've been working on in that area?
Sure. Well, so and it goes back to what Maxine had said. Whilst we may not be doing as much operating on a weekly basis or day-to-day basis, there is still training going on. And I look back at my registrars and the registrars in my hospital over the last 4 to 6 weeks, and what I see is that they are busy negotiating changed lists. They are trying to sort out how they're going to manage their patients who are anxious, who can't get into hospital. So there's a lot of work being done, and they're exercising collaboration, leadership, a lot of management, and of course self-care. And those are the sort of things that the training boards have all agreed that these are important parts of training that they want to be capturing and want to be measuring and assessing. And so training essentially continues despite all the events around COVID. And as Maxine said, operating and technical skills is really only one component of a whole raft of other competencies, which are all absolutely mandatory and necessary to be a surgeon. So essentially training continues. It's in a different format. One hopes that over time that we will get back to being able to address all 10 competencies. But nonetheless, at the moment, training continues because all the other competencies can still continue to be assessed and practiced. On that front, the training boards do not envisage that this time of training is not going to be accredited. In fact, they view this as in the opposite perspective. That is, here's an opportunity to continue to allow trainees to progress, and that is the primary intention, is to ensure that trainees continue to progress and not be held back just because they didn't get enough operating. So there were questions around, well, what will happen with my term? Will it be disaccredited? Will I not progress? I think the opposite is true, in that the training boards have agreed to a very broad but firm principle that they will find all the evidence they can on your training to actually allow you to progress. And I guess for that reason, we are asking that you continue to have your midterm assessments, your in-training assessments, continue to have the dialogue between yourself and your supervisors, and maybe instead of asking about how you're performing as an operator, ask them, how are you performing as managing the wards? How are you performing managing the changes in operating lists, in the types of meetings you're having, and whether your management skills have been appropriate and effective. And so those will all be captured in your in-training assessments. And so the assessments will continue, your training will continue, your supervision will continue. And as Julian has said, the resources and personnel behind the scenes which are supporting that type of activity, as training boards, etc., are still in place. So those resources need to be funded, and that's why those training fees continue to be put to good use. So from that point of view, I don't think there is any, that's the principle that guides how we are using your training fees, particularly during this particular time. It's not as though people behind the scenes are resting on their laurels in that the college is collecting fees which aren't being spent towards your own training. In fact, they are continuing to be spent towards your training. Yes, Julian.
I know we need to move on, but just while we're wrapping up around fees, there's some related questions around those who've paid and are struggling to get their money back. So can I just apologise? We obviously had received significant funds for all, the exams, courses, etc. And so it's been a large piece of work. And actually, not just in terms of the logistics for the college, but also in terms of the banking system. Banks don't like giving money out, you might be surprised to hear, and it unsettled them. And indeed, there are rules about how much money you can move around, particularly in New Zealand. And so we were actually very limited to how quickly we could refund people in New Zealand because of those money laundering rules. So my apologies. I'd like to say that, as has been implied by one of the questions, that we could kind of have people on credit. But the system isn't quite as sophisticated as that. So unfortunately, we're going to have to give people their money back and then charge people separately. We can't kind of hold a credit facility for you. So apologies for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Julian.
Yeah.
Yes, Adrian.
Yeah. So on the issue of training progression, and I think this was a question that was a common theme in the questions that came through. Training boards are expecting that the vast majority of trainees will progress from this term to the next term for the reasons that I've just outlined. And if a trainee is short on numbers, and let's say a training board requires you have to do 100 majors in 6 months and you fall short, you do 60 or 70, that in itself, if it's due primarily because of the COVID restrictions and the COVID requirements to reduce elective waiting lists, elective operating, then that will not be used to penalise you. You as a trainee, if you've met all your other training requirements, will continue and you will progress into your following term. at the end of the day, your training is not just based on just 1 6 month or 1 year of training. It will look at the entirety of your training. And for those programs which have moved more towards competency-based training, then it becomes less of an issue about the numbers and more about what you've done with the experiences that you've had and how you're demonstrating that you've met your competencies. So the training boards themselves have acknowledged that they're expecting that they're anticipating that they will progress the vast majority of trainees, and there will be a few trainees who may need to have an extension to training because there are some mandatory requirements that they have not met. But that's going to be determined on an individual basis, a case-by-case basis. There's no training board that I have spoken to that has looked over the last few weeks and considered that the majority of their trainees may not be progressing. And training boards are keeping a close eye on what's actually happening at the grassroots level.
Yes, so thanks, Adrian. That does lead on to a few other anxieties that have been expressed too, and both in the written questions here that have come in and elsewhere, and that is, is there going to be mandatory, extra training to do because of this? And one of the principles we established very early on was that, no trainee should be disadvantaged by interruptions by COVID. And the other was that if part of that lack of disadvantage was that they wouldn't be time expired in the activity. Either trainees or IMGs wouldn't suddenly run out of time to finish the program. So, they could be extended up for 12 months, but that was put there as a reassurance and a backstop in the worst case scenario. It wasn't intended to signal that your training period would be mandatorily extended. James, would you like to the trainee view on
Sure.
this area?
So I suppose very early in the pandemic, it wasn't clear in any sense as to what trainees, the degree of disruption that trainees would be experiencing through the coming few months. And many of our initial fears about trainees being wholesale redeployed into EDs and ICUs to intubate people haven't happened. It's not necessarily the case that will never happen, but it looks at this stage of things to be less likely. And so it's more clear to the college now that the approach that Adrian and BSET and therefore the specialty training boards are taking with respect to finding any way that we can to allow a trainee to progress unless there's a significant issue that means that we can't, really is a positive, it's really a trainee focused approach. And it means that we're confident that trainees by and large should be able to make their progress through wherever they can. Now, that approach does require that some mandatory parts of our training, like exams and courses, are modified in a way, if possible, to go along with that principle. And so, indeed, if the college finds itself in a position whereby some of those things just simply cannot be run, if it's not safe to have two people in the same room at the same time by the end of this year, well, that's restrictions that will be imposed upon the college that mean that we have very limited scope to work within. But there is goodwill and there is hard work happening to make sure that whatever restrictions we find ourselves in, that we're able to find ways to progress trainees through the system, get trainees out the other end. And then I'm aware that many trainees feel that how their juniors are currently progressing through, and therefore questions of selection are front of mind also, and therefore what can be done if there are people moving out the end in terms of bringing people in the start. I wonder, Phil, whether it's an opportune time to talk briefly about questions of selection.
Yes, I thought we might just talk about progression through training first, sure. And then that will lead on to that. So that's another series of questions. Is all variations of that? Is the current my current terms going to be credited as 6 or 12 months? What about the rotation of terms, etc.? And I might ask Adrian to address that first, and then Maxine, perhaps if you could give the New Zealand, or, any differences and that might apply to New Zealand.
Thank you, Phil. So the intention is that if a trainee has done 6 months of training, then they will have that period of time recognised as 6 months of training, even though there may be disruptions at that time. I guess the exception to that might be where the disruptions have meant that a trainee, him or herself, has not actually been able to attend training if they've been unwell or have had to be quarantined for prolonged periods of time, and they and that was one of the questions. It would be the exceptional, though, rule to have someone quarantined for an extended period of time or off sick. And if that's the case, then obviously that the training board will consider that and make a decision in as fair and equitable a way as possible for that trainee. For those trainees who, for whatever reason, I guess related more to COVID, are unable to move from one training post to another, the training boards are, again, their principle is that if you stay in the same training post, then that will be counted as a second part of the year. That is, it's still a second term, albeit in the same training environment, same training post. Now, clearly that's also going to be dependent on the specialty. So some of the specialties where you're spending a 12-month rotation stay, say in cardiothoracics or pediatrics, when you should be only spending 6 months, that may have an impact in terms of your overall case mix and experience throughout the entire training. And so there may, whilst that period of time may be recognised as 2 accredited terms, there may still need to be an extension to training to allow for additional terms that will give you the breadth and depth of training experience. So again, it does imply that there is a case-by-case determination, but in principle, a 6-month rotation, which is traditionally recognised as 1 accredited term, will continue to be recognised as that, even if a trainee doesn't move on from that time, or even if there's a fair amount of or some disruption to that term.
Thanks. So Maxine, as part of that, I guess that too was some trainees are feeling stressed by having to move, and others are feeling stressed because they can't move. Can you just throw some light on principles of that anyway, and how you're coping with that?
So I think the New Zealand situation is very similar to Australia. There are, at this time of year anyway, because most trainees will be in one location for the rest of the year, there will be some that would ordinarily move between different hospital boards halfway during the year. But I would anticipate that those training boards would take that into account. And some of those limitations are not to do with anything to do with the college, they're to do with requirements from our district health boards and Ministry of Health around COVID safety. But all of those kind of things would be considered on a case-by-case basis as well, like Adrian's mentioned for Australia. I think there are real valid issues and concerns for trainees having to move in terms of not just moving hospitals and whether that's a possibility, but also all the constraints around finding accommodation and rentals and new cities or towns, wherever you may need to go, and how open that is within the constraints of COVID limitations from various levels of lockdown in New Zealand. So, but I mean, at the moment, things look like they're probably opening up more, and that will become less of an issue. But it is a constantly changing kind of space at the moment. And I think everyone is kind of cognizant of that and of the extra pressures that puts on trainees and their families.
So it certainly is a very, very difficult thing personally. We recognise that for you. So I get, and the other thing going on, I guess, is that it's really being driven by the jurisdictions and the government restrictions rather than the college. And the college, as part of our principles, will seek to accommodate those limitations in otherwise planned rotations, as far as, you know, still getting you a good training experience. But the college is not driving the change in what would normally happen in terms of rotations through different posts. So that does bring us on to a little bit, sorry, just going past, there's a few questions just come up about that, those exams, which specialties are going ahead, which are not. I've got to say at the moment, that's not, you know, well, all want to go ahead, but some specialties would be able to provide exam in different circumstances, and that's a piece of work going on at the moment, and so we will be hopefully able to answer that more in a couple of weeks' time. But the intention is from all specialties, they all want to provide the exam, and so that's, yeah, so everyone's on at the moment, and some are going to have more difficulty than others doing there, but we're aiming to achieve that. So so just going on to James, you wanted to start at entry, but I think if we go exit. So one of the big problems in this, of course, is while training's interrupted, it's interrupting people out of the end of the training scheme going on to the fellowship or post-fellowship posts. And there's lots of questions about that, and also people coming in the other end, and obviously all depends on each other. Do you have to get the whole pipeline, if you like, moving? But I hate referring to you as trainees as water in the pipe. That's not how I think of you at all, but certainly in an economic sense, the government and that, you know, it does feel it, and also I guess it affects you very much, keeping the whole thing moving. So out the other end is, you know, is potentially a problem if you were in your last year of training, you're otherwise finished your training requirements but can't get the exam. Or potentially, I guess, if you're one of those, as Adrian says, one of those few people who has had their training interrupted so much this year that they just need a few other competencies ticked off. So perhaps, Adrian, again, would you like to start off with some of the thinking about you know, what might happen at the other end? And this is, once again, it's a moving feast. So a few weeks ago, yeah, it looked like, you know, we weren't going to be able to move, and we were making all sorts of contingencies for how people might practice without the exam. And now it looks much less like that, but perhaps you could just give some principles we've been discussing around that.
Sure, yes. So thanks, Phil. So I guess there are a number of groups of trainees to consider. So one group would be those trainees who, if the fellowship exam goes ahead this year, then they'll get their fellowship exam, but they still fall short in some component of their clinical training. In that situation, the training board has the option to say, yes, we will grant you provisional fellowship, and if you have access to a post-fellowship post, then they may actually consider, depending on the type of post, they may actually consider what happens in that post, as long as it's supervised and assessed, may well be sufficient to meet your rest of your training, clinical training requirement. And that's a variation, if you like, of the provisional fellowship. Another example might be the trainee who sits the exam, does not pass the exam this year, and wonders, well, what's going to happen next year, particularly if there is if there's a reduced number of people moving through the system. The training boards are committed to allocating those trainees to accredited training posts. And so every effort will be made to do so, and that would mean that trainees in that position would have priority on accessing training posts. So that's that group. I guess the other group would be on the chance that the fellowship exam does not go ahead, then there will be a larger cohort of trainees who are who would have expected to pass and gone on to post-fellowship posts. Those trainees obviously will not be able to be awarded a fellowship, and the training boards would make every effort to, again, ensure that trainees were in appropriate posts, and then I guess the anticipation would be that it's far more likely that fellowship exam will progress next year. So those are at least three scenarios. There was another scenario where trainees would get their fellowship exam, but the post-fellowship posts, and some of these are run by various surgical societies around Australia and New Zealand, have not selected for next year's positions. And so they wondered what would happen to them if they can't access a post-fellowship position, particularly if overseas positions are scarce because of the travel restrictions. At this stage, those societies or this post-fellowship programs have not made any contingencies to try to select late, as far as I'm aware. But the question has been asked of the college, well, what can we do to advocate for those post-fellowship programs to select? So that is something that the college can make inquiries and have discussions, but it needs to be realised that those programs fall outside the remit of the College of Surgeons, because those are run specifically by specialty societies, which are separate entities to the college. But it's a fair question to ask what can we do to advocate for those positions.
And certainly, as we see things moving and starting to move and look like they're going to move again, they'll be in the same position, I guess, as the college, and we're re-evaluating those decisions. So I think I wouldn't take anything in concrete at the moment. Julian, you've been keeping up with those questions coming in well, and they've got some themes there. Do you just want to just quickly answer some of those?
Yeah, I think I've been answering. I've been trying to answer most of them because they're mainly about the exam and some further clarification around the fellowship exam. So the main thing I've been saying is that I think, as you mentioned, we've got a webinar in 2 or 3 weeks' time, which we'll make sure is clearly advertised, which is going to focus on the examinations, and hopefully we will have a lot more detail about the fellowship then. So I've basically just been trying to reassure people that there is more information to come.
Okay.
Phil, there was a question that related to rotation changes. Shall I answer that? The question is there likely to be restrictions in moving hospital locations either locally or interstate at the mid-year rotation? It's probably less likely that there's going to be ongoing restrictions to move locally. What's perhaps more likely is interstate and certainly trans-Tasman travel. And BSET has discussed this, and whilst we think that the numbers may be not great, each training board has been asked to identify those trainees who they believe will need to move interstate or possibly trans-Tasman, particularly if you're talking about one of the smaller specialties, and they will notify me, and that number of trainees, some details need to be sought, but there will be the ability for the president of this college to then seek an exemption, and that exemption then will be granted by jurisdictions. So there is ability to seek exemptions for health workers to move across to be exempted from travel restrictions, but we need some specific information, and so the training boards are actually actively looking at that currently.
And Maxine, just going back to that slightly earlier thing about the post people who might get through their training, but the exam's still pending. Saying in New Zealand, it's not going to be a large problem. Many of those post-fellowship positions may well take a person without their exam. The exam subsequently be sat in that post-training year. Is that correct?
I think you're referring, Phil, to trainees who've completed their time but haven't been able to do the exam, and So I think one of the situations in New Zealand, which is a little bit different to Australia, is the ability for DHBs to employ people as medical specialists and to continue providing positions for them where they remain employed, but they may not yet have a fellowship. And so that's a possibility. I believe there would be flexibility around that to accommodate people who have not yet been able to achieve the exam, but have achieved everything else required of their training. And there are positions around New Zealand that have had precedent with that before for different situations. So I'm sure that DHBs would try hard to accommodate that, because it's obviously a workforce issue as well.
And that is one of the possible routes going in Australia too, if we got more interruption to the ability to sit exams, etc. Okay, so now it comes back to the selection, getting into a training, and we are also planning a webinar for those preset group in the coming weeks, but we can just give you an outline of what's once again the principles we've adopted. So Adrian, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I guess the conducting selection is not as complex, if you like, as conducting fellowship exams, and the components of the selection include the CV application, the referee reports. Some specialties have exams, and all specialties have interviews. And the components that are going to be more challenging to deliver are the interviews and the exam components. Having said that, all training boards, bar two, and that is cardiothoracics, may not be running selection this year for next year because of the numbers. They're looking at the number of vacancies, so they would be making a decision fairly shortly. And Plastic Surgery Australia feel that they may not be in a position to run their selection this year. However, having said that, all other training boards are very keen to run selection, and so there are plans ahead now to conduct selection possibly around the time or just prior to the fellowship exam. Those dates and timeframes will be released. My anticipation would be that the earliest we can communicate that out to the selection candidates will be end of next week. The starting point for the selection will be all of those applicants who registered to be selected this year and who have been identified as being eligible to apply for surgical training. So the key principles are very similar to that of the fellowship exam. That is, we want to have selection processes which can run in under COVID situations. That it will be maintained to the same standard. The weightings and the criteria do not change, so people who have prepared for selection according to those requirements and criteria, those will not change. It's going to be more the delivery of the face-to-face interviews that may well need to be modified, and so there are so the college is exploring with the training boards different platforms that may allow for remote interviews to occur.
James, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, thank you very much, Phil. As trainees, we often are in the most direct contact with junior doctors that are aspirants to joining our training program. And so I think that it's a question that many trainees are currently fielding. And thanks very much to Adrian for your update on the work that's just gone into selection. It's obviously reliant on many other things within the system permitting it. And if people aren't moving off the end of the training program at the end, they're the kinds of challenges that we as a college just need to work to ensure that we have the appropriate solutions for before we get ahead of things with respect to bringing more people on at the start. But that with the principles that we've described tonight about what the college is hoping for and planning towards with respect to delivery of a fellowship exam, and then getting sufficient numbers of trainees through the system and out the other end, the alignment then with allowing a selection process this year makes sense. So I suppose just an understanding that it's requires all the parts of the train to be moving together means that it's a complex task of getting all of this set up. We want to make sure that it's a task that we set ourselves up as a college to do well and to succeed at doing, and to minimise the risks of there being a significant disruptor that throws all of these plans up in the air again. So I suppose I appreciate that as trainees, we're very keen to find out what the definitive answer is to all of these questions. But sometimes we don't have all of the answers to all of the questions when we want them. The structure of determining the important principles that we would stick to when we're then making decisions about how the process runs is very important. And I hope at this stage that what the college is able to communicate with us as trainees is the essence of what those principles are. And I'm confident that those have been designed with goodwill and with trainees in mind. And now it's just the process of getting the details right. So we'll have those details as soon as they are clear enough to be able to communicate. But in the meantime, we can be reassured that there is a good, solid set of principles there with what we've been able to describe today.
Thanks, James. That's a very important sort of message getting towards the end of things, that we're often unable to give details, and I see there's a few questions there bemoaning that, but that's just because it is such a dynamic and fluctuant situation. But we have clear principle where we're moving, and our moving is very, you must be reassured, it's very pro-trainee and very we're really wanting to assist you to get on with your surgical training, surgical career. It is coming towards the end. Julian, you've been keeping an eye on all that stuff coming in and also summarising everything else. You'd like to say any closing words?
I have, yeah. I've been trying to answer some of the questions that have been coming in on the live chat. So thank you to everybody. It's great that we have that facility. It gives you a little bit of feedback of how the conversation's going. So thank you to all of you who've added supplementary questions as we've gone. I suppose I'd like to introduce one concept, which is around a little bit around partnership in these difficult times. So we've said one of our principles as a college is that we've said we will try to act consistently, fairly, and transparently. But I also think we're going to have to act in partnership. So, this evening, my voice became crackly at one point. We are going to have to rely on technology through this next period a little bit more. And, we may have to work in partnership around what you as a trainee group can expect of us, and how we will work as closely as we can with you to deliver what you need. But having to work in partnership around that, to accept that, at times it might be a slightly bumpy road. We may have to swerve occasionally. And I guess we're looking to you to work with us to help us navigate this. None of us have been through this before, and we will continue to do our best by you, but we will misstep sometimes. We probably have in some of your opinions already, and we will try to minimize that. And if you can work with us, we are all working, as James says, hard to try to support you through these unprecedented times.
Thanks, Julian. Maxine, anything you want to transmit at the end?
I just think this has been a really good opportunity, I hope, for trainees to see more of the face of the college and to hear, what REX is trying to do, genuinely trying to do to support our trainees, and to understand that everything we're doing is within a context of a much bigger picture outside of REX. And so REX really wants our trainees to have good training, and we want our trainees to be well and their families to be well. And all of this is in the context of COVID, which is much bigger than us. So I just really hope that from tonight, you know, there's some we've been able to convey that in some small way, and to have some kind of connection with you all, with a more face-to-face kind of value to it. And I mean, I kind of saw this tonight as an opportunity to hear and to from trainees what your questions and concerns were, so that we can elevate those, and in all the committee meetings that we have constantly in the background, that you'll know that we're trying to advocate on your behalf as much as we can, within the limitations of COVID and what our government's kind of policies around protecting us are. So I hope you can convey to your families some of that, because I know that it's stressful for, not just for you, but for, you know, especially those of you who are away from your families, with your, you know, while you're trying to support your departments, your families are in a different area, or you can't see them as much, or you've had to isolate for whatever reason. So we're aware of all of those stresses, because we have them as well, and we want you to get through this so that we can have you all as really good, awesome colleagues, because we know that's what you are.
How could we finish better than that? Thank you so much, Maxine. Tony, I only saw you under my plate there. Any last word?
Yes, I've eventually been able to join you. Can you hear me? Good, 2 out of 2. Can I just reiterate what Maxine said, and what you've all been saying is that it's hard times, uncharted waters. We're all pulling in the same direction. I now go from this meeting to the CPMC, which is all the college presidents, and I can tell you we're pushing for our trainees more than all the other 13 colleges, and that is because James doesn't get off the back if I don't. He passes on all your issues. For example, the redeployment hadn't been considered by the other colleges at all. Interstate travel hadn't been considered. So we have been raising all these issues on your behalf. I keep telling James and Raxter, and we listen and we pass them on. Now, it's very difficult to turn big ships around, but we are doing that, and this has taught us that we've been able to do that very quickly. So we listen to you very much. Thanks, Phil.
Okay, well, thank you all, and thank you for attending, and we look forward to catching up on those other webinars in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.